Okay, good morning. We are learning Lila Nishmas Mental Mariam Bas Kalman Urban Hashem Hashem Aliyah. We are on Kuf Mem Dalet Amud Beis Shel Beis Menashe Bar Menachem. You see that? It's the second column, halfway through the second column. Like a bunch of lines down from Kuf Mem Dalet Amud Beis. So we've been talking about tzchita. We're talking about squeezing fruits for their juices. And if you recall, we quoted a brisa. The brisa was interesting. The brisa said that you are allowed to squeeze plums, quinces, sorb apples on Shabbos in order to drink the juice of a lo berimonim, but not pomegranates. I'm just reviewing, not pomegranates. And then it said that in Beis Menashe, Bar Menachem, they would squeeze pomegranates during the week. Okay, so that's all we learned. We learned that they would squeeze pomegranates during the week, and that is explaining to us why you can't squeeze pomegranates on Shabbos, because they would squeeze it during the week, meaning they would make it into juice, whereas plums, quinces, sorb apples, no one would be squeezing, and therefore is not an issue. Okay, so basically that's the brisa. So now the Gemara is going to analyze this brisa. Okay, okay, so in the household of Menashe Bar Menachem, they would squeeze pomegranates during the week. Amr of Nachman, halacha b'shel Beis Menashe Bar Menachem. The halacha follows the household of Menashe Bar Menachem. And therefore, as the brisa said, you are not allowed to squeeze pomegranates on Shabbos. Okay? So far, so good. However, Amalei Rav Rav Nachman, Menashe ben Menachem Tanahu? Is Menashe ben Menachem a Tana in the brisa? In other words, what does the brisa say? The brisa says, you are allowed to squeeze the plums, etc., etc. You're not allowed to squeeze pomegranates. And then it says, and Menashe in his household used to squeeze pomegranates. And then you said the halacha is like him. He wasn't saying a halacha, right? He wasn't one of the people quoted in that brisa as someone who had an opinion. We're just saying, in this person's house, they would squeeze pomegranates. But he's not a bar plukta. He's not someone who is arguing or saying an opinion. We're just quoting the practice that was done in his house. So the Gemara says, "V'chi tema halacha ki aitana desavar la kishel Menashe ben Menachem." Maybe you want to say that what Rav Nachman meant to say is that the halacha follows the Tana of the brisa, who is following the practice of Menashe Bar Menachem. In other words, that since in the household of Menashe Bar Menachem, they would squeeze pomegranates during the week to make juice, and that's why he said it's prohibited to squeeze them on Shabbos, and the halacha follows that Tana. So the Gemara asks another question. Umi mishum desavar ki Menashe ben Menachem halacha kemoso. Do you want to say that because this Tana goes in accordance with Menashe ben Menachem, the halacha is like him? In other words, it's such a funny phrase. If you want to say the halacha is like the Tana of the brisa who says the pomegranates are asur, say the halacha is like him. If you said no, the halacha is like Menashe. So are we saying that it's because he holds like the practice of that household, that's why the halacha is like him? That doesn't make sense. And why doesn't it make sense? Because Menashe ben Menachem have a ruba de alma. Is Menashe ben Menachem the majority of the world? In other words, and now the way we're asking the question is as follows. The Tana of the brisa says you cannot squeeze pomegranates on Shabbos. Okay? And what was the reason that there is a support brought for the fact that you can't squeeze pomegranates on Shabbos? Why? Because in this one household they used to do so. That's funny. And then we're saying, the halacha is like him. In other words, we're saying the halacha is like, the fact that he quoted him, like that's a support to his halacha. It's not really. If I tell you, you can't do that, the whole discussion on the table over here is this thing considered juice? So if I say, okay, this one household goes ahead and squeezes, celery to make juice, therefore it's juice. No, this one household doesn't. I mean, that doesn't make it something which we'll consider juice, unless you want something just because one person does it, that's what makes it juice. Like it's very strange. Yeah.
Is this the first time you're concerned about the bizarre language in the Gemara?
We always have these types of questions. Oh. Yeah. Okay. So again, the Gemara's ultimate question over here is are we going to say the halacha is like someone because they hold like one? Is the halacha like is Menashe Bar Menachem's practice significant for halacha? The fact that one person squeezes these fruit to make it juice, is that enough to say, we're going to treat it like juice? He's just one person. The Gemara says, no. But the fact that one person does so does indeed make something into the fact that someone the fact that someone has this practice is enough to make it the halacha for other things. Let's see. So we're going to bring proof to that. It's not. We learned in the Mishnah, and this is regarding kiliak, regarding kilayim. Kilayim, there is a halacha that if a person in a vineyard, if a person plants another type of plants, another type of produce in a vineyard, together in a vineyard, then this is then the produce there becomes asur. All the produce becomes aser. It's a practical. It's called kilayim. It's like shatnez. In other words, two different types of products mixed together is going to be problematic. With a vineyard, there's extra stringencies, and anything planted within a vineyard is going to become aser. So the Gemara now gives an example of something which at least according to one opinion, is going to be aser. It's not as taught in the Mishnah. Hamekayim kotzim bakerem. If a person plants thistles in a vineyard, thistles are like thorns. Those are typically something which are not seen as like a plant type thing. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kidesh. Kiddush we normally think means holy, but holy, the word holy really means it's separate. So in this context, Kiddush means it becomes aser. You just were in violation of kilayim, and therefore the thistles and the grapes, the grapes in that vineyard are going to become aser. The Chacham disagree. They say in mekadesh eladavar shekamohu mekaymin. The Chacham disagree. They say, wait a second, who plants thistles? No one plants thistles. It's only to make a vineyard aser, to be in violation of kilayim, it has to be something which people normally plant. If it's something that a person doesn't normally plant, it's something which just like crops up. It doesn't
Weeds.
like weeds, right? That would exactly. Thistles are a form, essentially. It's not a weed, but it's similar in the sense that you don't care about it. So come say exactly. If there are weeds in a vineyard, would we say it's aser? No, we wouldn't say it's aser. And therefore, they say since people don't plant thistles, it's not problematic. So ask the Gemara from Rabbi Chanina, my time of Rabbi Elazar. Why does Rabbi Elazar say that thistles will make a vineyard aser? In other words, he will agree that weeds do not make a vineyard aser. So why does he say thistles are aser? Shekain baravia mekaymin kotzei sadus l'gmaleim. In Arabia, people actually have fields of thistles. Why? Because camels apparently eat thistles. I think we saw this earlier that they eat thistles as part of their food in order to help break down the food. I think that's the idea. Meaning they mix it together with their produce in order, not that they eat thistles, but thistles are put in as a form of breaking down some of their food. Bottom line is, at least in Arabia, they plant thistles, and therefore what are we seeing? We see that in one place they do something, and that creates significance for everyone else. In other words, Elazar is saying in Bavel, in Israel, everywhere else, thistles are going to be enough to considered a food to invalidate a vineyard, even though it's only done in one place. So that would seem to be a support to what we just saw above. In other words, we're troubled by why does Rav Nachman invoke Menashe ben Menachem when it comes to the halacha about pomegranates. We said just because this one household does it, that's enough to make it juice for the whole world? And now the Gemara is saying, yeah, look, we have thistles. Thistles for me and you are nothing, are a waste, are a pain. We don't want them. But since in one place in Arabia, they do consider them special, we see a Tana, Rabbi Elazar, who says that since it's in one place it's important, it's going to be important everywhere. Okay, so the Gemara says, what kind of comparison is that? Midi area, next column. Is that a proof? Da Aravia Asra. Arabia is a place. Right? Arabia is not a small place, it's a huge place, right? Over here, Menashe ben Menachem is one person. In other words, how could you say, since in Arabia they do something and that's going to define the halacha of the whole world, therefore so too, when Menashe ben Menachem does something, it's going to define the halacha of the whole world. Are you crazy? Arabia is like a huge a place with tons of people. Granted, it's localized, but we could say since in one place it's significant, we'll say that's true for the whole world. But one individual, that's not a comparison, and therefore the Gemara is going to reject this. And now we're going to try to bring another understanding of what Rav Nachman was saying. What the Brisa was saying by quoting Menashe bar Menachem, and why Rav Nachman came along and when he said the halacha is like this, he highlighted Menashe bar Menachem. What was that Brisa doing? At the end of the day, again, let's go back to the Brisa. The Brisa said, you are allowed to squeeze plums and sorb apples and quinces or whatever. You're allowed to squeeze these fruits. You are not allowed to squeeze pomegranates because of Menashe bar Menachem. Who cares about Menashe bar Menachem? That's the question that the Gemara is going to address. And the question is even stronger because Menachem came along and said, halacha is like, not just that Brisa, but Menashe bar Menachem. Why is he so important? What is the significance of him? That's what the Gemara is going to ask. Okay, so let's see. So the Gemara says, the reason is because of something Rav Chisda taught. Dam Rav Chisda, Turadin sheschatan unisanam b'mikvah. Okay, so in the ancient world, they had no such thing as borscht. Okay, borscht was not a drink. Okay, borscht should still not be a drink, as I've explained in the past. I don't think it's a drink. But the bottom line is,
have you ever had shav?
No, I don't. Okay, well, I definitely don't plan on it then. But the point is that beets back in the day were not a drink. Okay, so just have to keep that in mind when we read this Gemara. Meaning there was no such thing as borscht. No one was drinking beet juice. Okay. Let's say a person took beets in the ancient world where no one made borscht. Okay, and they squeezed the beets into a mikvah. Postlin as a mikvah b'shina mara. The Gemara says the mikvah will be invalid because of a change in the appearance of the water. Okay, there's a halacha. It's a debate if it's d'Rabbanan or d'Oraisa. But if a mikvah is not clear. If it has if it has a different color, distinct color, then the mikvah becomes pasul. Okay, maybe it's derabanan because of a decree. Maybe it's deraisa. Fine. Bottom line is, it's going to be pasul, and beets are going to invalidate the mikvah. Okay? Ask the Gemara, but beets are not typically squeezed, and therefore the invalidation, the assumption of the Gemara is the invalidation is premised on the fact that it is a beverage. That it's not just that if you put like food dye into it, everyone would agree it's not going to be, the assumption right now is that everyone's going to agree it's not a problem. The issue is that maybe you're going to go ahead and take a juice or a beverage and put it in and use it. So the Gemara is asking, since beet juice is not a thing in the ancient world, so why would beet juice invalidate a mikvah? It's not a beverage. So granted it has a different color, but it's not a beverage. So elamai islach lememer. What do you want to say? Kevan dachshavinu havelahu mashka. It must be that it's true. Beet juice is not really a beverage, but this person that squeezed it, by definition, they demonstrated that they think that they want to make it into a beverage. They want to make it into something significant, right? So that's why the beet juice is going to be something which will invalidate a mikvah. Hachinami. So too for anyone who squeezes any fruit for their juice. Kevan dachshavinu havelahu mashka. By squeezing it, that does make it into a beverage. Okay, so let's pause here. Let's just try to understand how it relates to mikvah, and then we'll bring it back to our discussion. So what's happening over here is by a mikvah, the assumption is that unless something is a beverage, it's not going to invalidate a mikvah, even if it's different color. If I put food coloring into a mikvah, that's fine. But if I put orange juice into a mikvah, that's when it's going to be an issue because it's a beverage. So the Gemara asks, what about beets? Beets are not a beverage. The Gemara answers no. Once I squeeze it, I make it into a beverage. Okay, so what does it have to do with our discussion? So the Gemara now, let's bring it back to the case of the drinks that we saw earlier in the brisa. So the brisa said that if a person squeezes, plums, etc., you're allowed to squeeze plums, etc., on Shabbos. But based on what we're learning now, that you can't do so. It can't be done. You can't say that we're doing so for the sake of a drink. Because if it's for the sake of the drink, we just established the principle that kevan dachshavinu, once I wanted it, then it becomes a beverage. And therefore, when the brisa said above that I'm allowed to squeeze a plum on Shabbos, it couldn't have been saying that I was doing it for the sake of making a beverage. Can't be, because now we just established that if I squeeze something for the sake of a beverage, it's going to be usher. So rather, what must it be? I was squeezing it to get some juice out. Okay, so they say that sweetens the drink a little bit, meaning the juice sometimes is a little bit more acidic. So basically, I'm squeezing the juice out to make it a little bit sweeter, and that's when we're saying I'm allowed to do so. Okay? Still with me? It's a little complicated. Yeah, I squeezed it out. It's when the bright, again, we just established now that if I'm squeezing a fruit for the sake of a juice, then by definition it becomes a beverage. If something becomes a beverage, then again, what's the isser here? The isser was that we're talking about for Shabbos was something called mefarik. Mefarik was that there's a solid and there is a beverage. And I took the beverage out, right? If we said, if it's just liquid, it's fine. But if it's a beverage, it's a problem. Now we're saying that if any individual goes ahead and squeezes it, then by definition they've made it into a beverage. And therefore, now we're saying that in that brisa, we're talking about, we can't be talking about when a person squeezes out for a beverage, because then it would be usher, right? And so what we're saying is that a person's allowed to squeeze out the liquids from a plum, because it is only in a case where they're not doing it for a beverage, okay? And yet, when it comes to...
I'm lost on why they're doing it for. Yeah, I agree with Svi.
Okay, so let's say, meaning you have the Rishonim say it actually sweetens the fruits. In other words, but let's say not. Let's say it's just you. Let's say you're traveling and you don't want your bottom of your bag to be all icky. Whatever, doesn't matter. Any reason you're squeezing it to get any liquid out. Come up, yeah. I'm saying okay.
I'll take that.
Perfect, great. Okay. So now the Bryce is saying I'm allowed to squeeze it as long as I'm not doing it for a beverage. Okay. But when it comes to pomegranates, right? So again, what does the Brisa say? The Brisa now the way we're reading the Brisa is that I'm allowed to squeeze out plums to get the liquid out because I don't want liquid, okay? But I'm not allowed to squeeze a pomegranate to get the liquid out, right? Even though I'm not doing it for juice, right? But now, what's the concern over there? Why would we say you can't do so by a pomegranate? It's not because we're saying the juice, when I'm squeezing it out, it's not that the juice now is considered like it's not that the liquid is considered a juice. Again, let's go back to the Brisa based on what we're saying now. The Brisa says, or a reread of the Brisa says, I'm not allowed to squeeze a plum out on Shabbos to get the liquid out, even though it's nothing to do with the beverage, right? Sorry. I said that wrong. You're right. I'm allowed to squeeze the plum out to get rid of the liquid. as long as I'm not doing it for a juice, right?
Isn't that border though?
A different discussion for another time. Good, fair question. But this is a long. Yeah, hold on. It's a fair question. Bottom line is, I'm allowed to squeeze the plum as long as I'm doing it just to get rid of liquid. Okay, but I'm not. But what did the Brisa say? I'm allowed to do it for plums. I'm not allowed to do it for pomegranates, right? But I can squeeze the pomegranates to get rid of the liquid. Now, is the reason now we're no longer talking about mefarek in its classical sense. We're not saying that because it's a beverage by definition, right? We're not saying it's because it's a beverage. So what's the reason you can't squeeze the pomegranate on Shabbos, even though you're just doing it because you don't want liquid there? What's the reason? The reason is because of a decree. The reason because of the decree is since some people drink pomegranate juice, therefore there's a decree that I might go ahead and squeeze it out, not for the sake of getting rid of the liquid, but to make juice. Now, for that, we're able to say, since there are some people in the world, like Menashe bar Menachem, who use it for juice. In other words, you see what happened? In other words, initially we were saying the reason you can't squeeze pomegranates out on Shabbos is because of the fact that it's considered juice. And so now that's a deoraisa. We're saying you can't go ahead and squeeze it out because it's considered juice. How do you know it's considered juice? Because one guy does it. One guy does it, that's going to make it juice? That's ridiculous. And that's what the Gemara rejected. Now we're saying the reason I can't squeeze it out is not because it's considered juice. You're not doing it for juice. But the point is that you might be led to doing it for juice. Oh, now we're talking about a decree. If you're talking about a decree, okay, so you say some people do it, that's already significant. And now I can understand why we invoke Menashe bar Menachem to say that since some people do it, it's going to be problematic. Okay? A little convoluted, but basically it makes sense, right? Now we're rereading the Brisa and saying, again, let's just quickly summarize. It's not so bad. Now that we got to the conclusion. Bottom line is, initially the way we read the Brisa was, you are allowed to squeeze all fruits on Shabbos to make a beverage. You're not allowed to squeeze rimon and pomegranates to make a beverage on Shabbos. Okay, and then we said, because Menashe bar Menachem. And the Gemara said, just because Menashe bar Menachem drinks pomegranate juice, what does it have to do with me? I don't drink pomegranate juice, and one person doing it should not impact everyone else. So don't tell me it's called a juice. The Gemara says, you're right, it's not called a juice. The whole thing is based on the decree. What we're saying is you're not going to make it juice because you're not going to squeeze even a plum to make plum juice. That you can't do on Shabbos. What we're saying is you're allowed to squeeze a plum to get rid of its liquid. Okay, that fine. But you can't squeeze a pomegranate to get rid of its liquid. Why? Because some people go ahead and make juice. Okay, we're talking about a British decree, and we're talking about a safeguard. We're saying, okay, so some people do it, that's going to impact the halacha. Now we can understand. Okay? Let's go back to we're going to go back to the juice in the mikvah. Papa Amar. Now, we're just looping back to the discussion we had about a mikvah. Mishum David Damar, he says, the reason beet juice is invalid has nothing to do, you assume the reason beet juice was invalid was because of this concept of achshave. The person considered it to be a beverage. He says nothing to do with that. He says, Mishum David Damar she'en osimenu mikvah lechatchila. The reason beet juice. In other words, we have a good read of the Brisa, but now we're just saying that your proof from this Mishnah by mikvos, that's not a good proof. You wanted to say that the reason the beet juice is going to invalidate the mikvah is because it's a beverage. It's not true. The reason that it's invalidates the mikvah is mishum davar davar shein osem menu mikvah lechatchila. You're not supposed to make a mikvah out of beet juice, obviously. You have to use water. B'chol davar shein osem menu mikvah lechatchila postel es a mikvah b'shin amara. Rav Papa says simple. The reason beet juice is usher is not because you've invalidated the mikvah because it's a beverage. It's just that we have a different rule. A rule is that if it's something which you can't make a mikvah out of, then you can't. If that same substance you can't make a mikvah out of, even a little bit, as long as it changes the color, invalidates a full mikvah. Nothing to do with the fact that it's a beverage. Okay, fine. So that's a side machlokes about why beet juice invalidates a mikvah. Okay, and now the Gemara is going to say that we have a similar discussion about a substance invalidating a mikvah because of color. Okay, so we're going on a bit of a tangent to the tangent right now. Let's see. It's not hasam. If wine or vinegar or olive water falls into a mikvah and changes its appearance, pasol, it invalidates the mikvah. Okay, wine, we know what that is. Vinegar, we know what that is. Olive water, what is olive water? Olive water is basically the water that comes out of olives when they're first pressed. Okay, that also invalidates a mikvah. Ask the Gemara, who holds that olive water is regarded as a beverage? What's the assumption of the question? The assumption of the question is the only thing that's going to invalidate a mikvah is a beverage, right? Clearly not like our papa, right? So Gemara is now going to bring a source to say that olive water is a beverage. So let's see. Amar Abaye, okay, tangent on tangent on tangent. Amar Abaye, Rav Yaakovi, it's Rav Yaakov Omer, Mochel Haru Kamashki. He says olive water is like a beverage, and therefore, okay, this discussion, this Brisa which we're quoting, is nothing to do with mikvos. It's about something being a beverage in regards to tuma. And he says that olive water is like a beverage, and therefore is susceptible to tuma. Umatam amru mochel yot betchila tahar. Okay, so if that's the reason, if it's true that olive water is a beverage and is therefore susceptible to tuma, Okay, then why do they say that olive water that comes out immediately at the beginning of the pressing process is not susceptible to tumah? In other words, there is a halacha that the olive water that comes out in the beginning of the process is not going to be susceptible to tumah. Why? Lefisha ena rotza b'kiyumo. The person doesn't desire its existence. In other words, the water that comes out in the beginning of the process is actually not so good. It's only the stuff that continue to come out after that actually is meaningful, is substantial, and therefore that's why we say the stuff that comes out in the beginning is not going to be tummy. This don't worry so much about the details over here. Rav Shimon Omer, mochel eno kamashka, olive water is not like a beverage, okay, at all, and therefore it's not susceptible to tumah at all because it's not like a beverage, okay. Umatam omru mochel hayot mi'ikol beisabad tame. So if you want to tell me it's not a beverage at all, then what's the reason they say the olive water that flows out from the olive press is susceptible to tumah? If you tell me olive water is nothing, answer the Gemara because that olive water, granted it's not a beverage, but it's mixed in with oil. If it's mixed in with actual oil, it's not just water. There's not pure water that comes out. It's mixed in with oil, and therefore it's tummy not because of the water, but because of the oil that's mixed into it. Okay, fine. So the Gemara, fine. Bottom line is that you see Rav Yaakov holds that all olive water is considered a beverage, and therefore he's the one who holds that olive water will invalidate a mikvah by changing its appearance. Okay, so far we're still okay. So the Gemara now says, "My binai." What's the difference between Rav Yaakov and Shimon? They argue about right. In other words, they both hold that the water that comes out, the olive water that comes out in the beginning is tahar, and the water that comes out at the end is tameh. So they argue about a case where it comes out of the pressure of the olives upon one another, and before it actually starts being pressed. There, it seemingly is like almost no oil comes out, and maybe according to Rav Shimon, it would be tahar. According to Rav Yaakov, it would be still considered a beverage and would become tameh. Okay, all aside point. What comes out of this whole discussion? That Rav Yaakov holds that olive water is considered a beverage, or that then the person discussing over here, we don't, an anonymous opinion says that the Mishnah that says that olive water invalidates a mikvah is because the fact that it's a beverage. That's what's coming out right now. It's because it's a beverage. Now, Rava argues with the Tana that just explained that the reason, the Amor above just explained that the reason olive water invalidates a mikvah is because it's a beverage. Rava says, no, it's nothing to do with it being a beverage. You're not allowed to make a mikvah with olive water. And therefore, something that you don't make a mikvah with will invalidate a mikvah because of a change of color. So, with the whole reason of this entire olive water quotes was to show that there are other Amoraim which have the same debates about what invalidates a mikvah. Is it something that's a beverage, or is it just something you don't make a mikvah with and has nothing to do with being a beverage? So it's that same parallel discussion. Okay? Let's move on. Now, an important halacha, which is very, very relevant, which comes up a lot. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Sochet Adam Eshkol Shalanav L'Sochak Zer. A person is allowed to squeeze grapes into a pot of food on Shabbos, Avolo L'Sochak Ar, but not into a bowl. Okay, so until now we've been saying you can't squeeze, and we still have it, this fruit or that fruit to make liquid. You can't go ahead and make pomegranate juice. You certainly can't go ahead and make wine on Shabbos. Can't make olive oil on Shabbos. You can't squeeze more or less any fruit, seemingly any fruits, in order to make its juice. However, now we're saying that's true only when you're making it into a beverage. But if by the time it falls, by the time it stops moving, it falls into a solid, you didn't make it into a beverage, and therefore you're not a violation of the Isser of Mefarik. Okay? So this is very relevant on Shabbos. You want to go ahead and squeeze some lemons into your into your fish. No problem, right? Because to go ahead and make lemon juice would seemingly be usher, and is usher according to most poskim, right? So squeeze it into a bowl. But to go ahead and to squeeze it into a solid, then you didn't actually make a beverage, and therefore it never really was a standalone beverage. Since by the time it fell, by the time it stopped moving, it just goes into a solid, and therefore it is going to be mutter. Okay, so Amar Rav Chisda Midiber Benu. Nilmad, from the words of our teacher we learn, Choliv Adam Eiz L'Sochak Dera. You're allowed to milk a goat into a pot, into like a pot of food, okay? But you're not allowed to milk it into a bowl, meaning without any okay, and without we're just putting it into a liquid, you can't do. Alma Kasavar, next page. Alma Kasavar Mashke Habala Ochelhu. We see from Shmuel that the beverage extracted from a food is regarded as a food. Okay, very interesting application. This we'll stop over here. We're gonna have a whole discussion about this further, but a discussion about this is making lemonade on Shabbos. There's a famous Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, who says that in Egypt, he says everyone's making lemonade. How are they making lemonade? They're squeezing lemons into water. How could it be done? So he gives a couple of answers. One of the answers that he gives, and what comes out of the whole discussion is that the way you can make lemonade on Shabbos, a mutter way of making lemonade on Shabbos is to squeeze the lemons into sugar. If you squeeze it into sugar, then it never was a standalone into a substantial amount of sugar, and then it never was a liquid onto its own. It went from a liquid into a solid, and then you add the water at that point. So what happened is you went liquid to solid. That's fine. It never was a beverage, and that's the best way. Mishnah Berurah Paskin is the best way to make lemonade. The ideal way to make lemonade on Shabbos is to do it in that fashion. Okay, I'll pick up tomorrow.